Okay, welcome to the next lecture. You remember last lecture we have discussed the various approaches of conservation, and we also mentioned that there is no hard and fast rule. It has to be decided case by case. So, it is case specific. So, if there is no rule and so what are the guidelines and what guides one team of conservators or a conservator to decide that which approach has to be taken? And for that we have to understand the ethics of conservation. So, today we will discuss about the ethics of conservation. These are not actually rules or acts, but these are guiding principles. So, we have to see it in that context. So, let us see what is the role of the conservator. The conservation especially in the 20th century, because professional conservation developed in only 19th 20th century, developed in the 20th century traditionally been involved into two aspects. One is the scientific practice which the conservator applied, and the technical skill also, which is very important to preserve the cultural material. So, if we understand these two aspects, and if you see, so we are saying the scientific practice is very important and the technical skill is very important, and that actually predominated the conservation practice or the role of the conservator. Now, if we try to see that the example, so this is what generally a lot of documents, lot of guidelines have been prepared to, where the major aspect is the science and technology and how it is applied to the conservation practice. Now, in that case, so as I said, the conservation and the scientific practice and technical skills, so these actually predominated the conservation scenario. So, construction, preservation and transmission of the cultural knowledge, that actually is the major role of the conservator. So, one should not think that the role of the conservator is to just apply the technical knowledge and to preserve the structure. It is the transmission of the cultural knowledge that is very important, and when a conservator applies the technical knowledge, one should be that should be kept in mind, that he or she is actually through the process of conservation is transmitting the cultural knowledge which is embodied in that cultural artifact. Let us take the example of the Humayun's tomb. It is a World Heritage Site and it is Aga Khan Trust for Culture project, and it is also very well known best practice, because it is the Nizamuddin renewal initiative, because it has incorporated the craftsmen which are who actually stay in the vicinity and who have been traditionally practicing, some of them, and to involve them in the conservation practice, going out of the purview of the Archaeological Survey of India, involving not only the local craftsmen, but also the craftsmen from other countries, and involving the entire community. That has become a very important aspect of the Humayun's tomb restoration process, and it continues. That community revival, involving them, the community, training them. So, these are all very important part of that. It's not, so if you see the Humayun's tomb, it's just not preserving the structure or restoring the structure is important, but it is that what are the cultural knowledge, how to train them, how to transmit the knowledge to the craftsmen, training them and also interpreting them and bringing them to the future generation, present generation, that has played a very important role. So, role of conservator is actually that. So, as we can see here, the evidences of the past knowledge. So, the evidence of the past knowledge, that is what is very important, and this means which these may be transmitted into the future, this becomes the practice for the conservation. And while conservator is doing that, he has to understand this scientific foundation based on a rationalistic principle, and as there is no hard and fast rule, one has to be guided by this code of ethics. So, these are very important part of the conservation practice when one has to understand these two aspects of the scientific foundation and the course of ethics. So, what are the code of ethics and what is the? So, these are the two almost arms of a conservation practice. So, the code of ethics is necessary process of articulating collective ideas. So, here the individual dogma, individual aspiration, individual decision of the conservation person or the practitioner is not important. One has to understand that they are actually conveying the collective ideals of a community, and also that has to be the scientific approach has to be based on evidence and hard facts. So, these two things have to be very clearly borne in mind when we talk. Let us take the example of the York Minster. I mean, I will explain the case that it was actually a very important cathedral in Yorkshire in York, and which got burned down. And in the process of burn down, what happened is that the rose window that got completely burned. So, this rose window what we see here is actually got completely burned, and while it got burned, fragments, thousands of fragments of glass pieces were there. Just before it got burnt, it was restored. So, it actually did not fall down, but it has minute cracks, thousands of cracks which developed. As you can see that the entire sort of a burning, the entire thing got burned down. Now, the question became, or the issue became, that should a new rose window or stained glass window will be built there and put up, or the fragments are there which should be restored or not. In that case, Peter Gibson, which is actually very well known person in this bit, the person who actually founded the York Glaciers Trust, he decided that a consolidation process. So, what he did is actually he injected a consolidant into the fragments, because they were all in place, but there were the cracks. So, the cracks sort of filled up the cracks, and they put the fragments into almost sandwiched into two pieces of glass. So, that the original piece remained and put it back. So, what we see today actually is the restored original stone glass or the stained glass window, and by the process of consolidation. Now, here what we can see is that the rationalistic approach also became very important, and also the code of ethics. So, these two arms actually guided that what should be the process. It needed a lot of scientific approach, skill, training and other, but also that what should be done is guided by the code of ethics. So, these are very important aspects of the conservation practice. Now, how did it all start? So, let us see the genesis of the conservation ethics. It is actually John Ruskin, and later on William Morris. We will see that later on when we will discuss about the history of conservation. He was a leading English art critic of the Victorian era, and he had a great influence on the idea of the conservation ethics. And two things actually were treated as very important. One is the age value, and another is the unity of feeling. This unity of feeling or the integration of the old structure are very important part of the conservation ethics, and that is gradually the foundation of the ethics of the conservation practice, that what should be done actually started. So, conservation thus is a practice that focuses on the preservation of the cultural knowledge. So, one must understand we are not talking about just the preservation of a structure, we are talking about the preservation of the cultural knowledge in objects. So, these objects or buildings or artifacts, they actually embodied the cultural knowledge which has been transmitted through generation, and the authentication of which creates an inseparable bond between the conservator and the conservation architect. So, here the conservator or the role of the conservator becomes a sort of an in between the knowledge and the conservation object. So, that is very important. So, the conservator and the conservation objects and the bond between them and how is sort of creating that is a very important aspect when we talk about the ethics of conservation. So, authentication, as we say, the authentication is very important, the authentication and the conservator object and this the bond between them. So, this is a very important aspects to be understood when we talk about that. And let us take an example of Sir Marshall. Sir Marshall was the Director General of Archaeological Survey of India, as you can see in the beginning of the 20th century, and he is the person who was responsible for conservation restoration of many of our traditional structure. Shachi Stup is one example. I think even Harappa, Mohenjo-daro and many other structure he sort of was responsible. And when we are talking the restoration of Shachi Stup, so as you can see that there is an old photograph of Shachi Stup. You can see that what we see today of Shachi Stup does not match with the old photograph. So, that means he actually embodied some of his knowledge about what Shachi Stup could have been and put the umbrella and the other structures on the top. So, his ideology, his thought process, what he thought that should be ideal for the restoration of Shachi Stup is very important. And so, here when we talk about Shachi Stup restoration and that conserved object has a relationship with Sir Marshall's ideology of what restoration means. So, that is a bonding what we are talking about. So, conservation thus is established as both ethical and scientific. So, again and again I am saying that these two parts are inseparable. If you see that not these particular sort of structure, this is a ceiling painting in Cooch Behar Palace, which is under Archaeological Survey of India. They have restored it. Now, if you see this painting, as we can see that what we see here, this part, this is a restored part because it got damaged. So, Archaeological Survey of India restored it. Now, these actually is not matching with the original part, and this type of restoration is not so authentic and it is not desirable also that it could have been left like that partly whatever is that, so that kept. So, that putting a new painting there, it was not very desirable in that case, and as you can see that it is actually not matching very much. So, these are actually these techniques may be possible. There are a lot of techniques of cleaning up, painting and other thing, but what should be adopted in a particular case, which scientific principles should be adopted and applied, it actually is guided by the ethics. That is why we are saying that they are actually very inseparable parts of the conservation practice. Now, when we are talking about the conservation ethics, also is important to understand that there is the influence of the particular setting, because case to case we said it varies. Now, when we are talking about settings, how communication and cultural memory influence the national identity. So, from one culture to another culture, one nation to one nation, from one community to another community, the principles and ideology may vary. So, one has to understand that, and in spite of the technical knowledge and expertise, one has to understand that, and ethics are also guided by that. So, actually when we talk about conservation, we talk about actually create a shared sense of cultural memory. So, this also we must understand, this shared sense of cultural memory is very important. If you remember that tombstone, which in the Australia we talked about, that how it sort of created a conflict between two sort of communities and how it was resolved. And so, the shared sense of cultural memory, it has to be it's very important to understand that. And impact on the ethical course of the conservator. So, all these things and how it is impacting the ethical course on the conservator is very important to understand. For example, we have talked about the Shinto shrines in Japan, where every 20 years the shrines are being constructed, and which is acceptable. It is a part of the tradition. This shrine is actually for 4th century BC, but what we see, the structure is actually not very old, it is very new, but it is a part of the Shinto culture, whereas so it is totally new. Where we also saw that the Warsaw city center, how it has been reconstructed because of a particular community's aspiration, the spirit, what they wanted to do. So, that is why we have to understand that a conservator has to be guided by the ethical course, which is also dependent on a particular context and a particular setting. Now, when we are talking about the genesis of the conservation ethics, as we say that it started with John Ruskin, then followed by William Morris, but it got sort of codified after the Second World War, because due to the Second World War a lot of devastation happened, a lot of heritage structure got demolished, and after the World War II there were official bodies were created that codified a set of values, and first was the Charter of Athens. First of the Charter of Athens in 1931, and it was followed by the Charter of Venice. So, this Venice Charter is very important in formulating course in order to create a common ground. So, that in spite of, irrespective of which culture, there are certain common principles which sort of guides. And the Venice Charter, as we say, that it is not really an act, they are not rules, but it is sort of a guiding principles which sort of guides a conservator what should be done in a particular case. So, this is very important to understand. Venice Charter we will discuss sometimes in detail later on. So, let us take one by one some of the standards of ethics which actually started or codified after the Venice Charter in 1964, and then each and every country has their own charter and others to guide that. But Venice Charter is almost a very common ground, it establishes a common ground. There are very few articles are there, but I am not talking about Venice Charter now, I am just referring Sir Bernard Filden's and we are talking about some of the almost like thumb rules for the ethical codes. So, first one, the condition of the building before any intervention and all methods and material used during the treatment must be fully documented. It is not just a measure drawing, it is a proper documentation or a condition mapping for the structure before intervention and during the intervention, what happened, which material, where, each and everything must be painstakingly documented for the future generation. This is a very important part of any conservation process. For example, if you see here is the St. Luke's Church in London, a condition survey drawing with the grid line. Now, the measure drawing definitely has been done, but the key defects has been annotated into the drawing to convey the scope of the repair. The blue shading areas represents the stone areas of stonework which are oil bonded to the brick structure behind. Areas of white represent the voids of the stonework. So on, so on. There will be a lot of drawings, photograph, documents, statement. All of these sort of are very important to understand that at what state the structure was found, what was the status, what are the different types of decay and damage, and then during the conservation process what really has been done, stone by stone, brick by brick, element by element, everything has been documented as sort of a holistically as possible, and all the sort of with whatever method which is more suitable for that particular restoration process. Second one, it talks about the historic evidence must not be destroyed, falsified or removed. If you see here the Sun Temple of Konark, and we can see here that whereas this one is quite in a good stage, but this particular one is not in such a good state. There are some sort of a decay which sort of happen, but nobody is trying to, or even if you see this part also, this is not there, but nobody is trying to replace that, or even nobody is trying to remove that, this part nobody is trying to remove that and replace that with a proper thing, where the craftsmanship or the technical know-how may be possible, available, it is available, still the craftsman can build that, but this is taken as a historic evidence. So, this is actually ethics says that this is not a desirable thing, not to fill up, until and unless it is required or essential for preserving the structure. Third ethical code says, any intervention must be minimum necessary. That when we talked about the approaches, we talked about that. Any intervention must be minimum. If just taking care of the environment is possible, we should not do the repair. If the repair is enough, we should not do the another consolidation. If the consolidation is enough, we should not do the restoration. So, step by step one has to sort of proceed. So, the guiding principle is that the minimum intervention. Now, again if we talk about the Konark Sun temple, and if you see that case, for example, if you see this one, you can see that there are certain parts, these parts which sort of actually is not desirable. I mean, because there are certain problems in that, but if you see these parts of there, they are quite harmonic. They have taken a minimum one, they have tried to match the material. If from far, it actually not making very disastrous scenario. So, what we see that this type of intervention or preservation is not actually desirable, whereas these probably because they have taken the profile, this is more or less a correct way of preserving the structure or keeping the structure for posterity. So, any intervention must be minimum, and any intervention must be governed by unswerving respect for the aesthetic, historical and physical integrity of the cultural property. Now, we are talking about integrity now, we will talk that in detail. So, this aesthetical, historical and physical integrity, they have to be understood very well. We in the last example, we saw that what we saw here is this integrity is not maintained, whereas in this case the integrity is maintained, physical and both aesthetics and historical. So, these are have to be decided case by case, and as we say that the most important thing to understand that we are dealing with the historical structures. So, the respect for that structure has to be there. I generally give an analogy. For example, you love your grandmother or grandfather. Okay. Now, if you just suddenly look at the young age photograph of your grandmother, she was very beautiful with black hair and other thing. Now, probably she has a white hair and other thing. You respect her, you love her, but you won't like to say that okay, you wear a wig or you dye your hair or you have to be straight as you looked at that time. No, one has to understand that she has aged, she has to age gracefully. As much as possible, one has to help her to keep in proper health, help her in the other thing, keep in good spirit, and not to take her back to when she was 16 years or 20 years or in her younger age. One has to accept that, and then in that stage how best the building can be preserved. So, and that is what we call the respect for the age. And one again I am saying the integrity of the cultural property. For example, if you see here Shana, this is, I mean, this is a stupa there with a lot of structures, some have sort of got demolished, it is here. But here the setting is important, the structures whatever stage they are is important to keep them as it is, and that is very important to keep them, and that need to be take care of the surrounding, the ground treatment, the visitors movement, everything comes within that. So, that is one of the very important part of when we are talking about the conservation of a structure, group of structures or an area. any proposed intervention should be reversible, and this is also another thing. Even if conservation ethics say that we can sort of use an improved or a modern technique which must be tested, because a conservation old structure cannot be treated as a guinea pig, but one has to understand it should be reversible, because something has happened, but in future some more advanced technique may sort of be discovered, and so one has to be reversible technique. That is a very important part, and at least not a prejudice whatever the intervention is done, it should not prejudice a future intervention whenever this may become necessary, and not hinder the possibility of later access to all evidence incorporated in that object. So, these are almost guiding principles for intervention in an historical structure. For example, if you see this particular case, there each and every element has been sort of what should be done and which wall and which color, each and every decision has been incorporated, and with after a proper decision has been written there before the conservation has been taken care of. So, again we continue with the proposed intervention, allow maximum amount of existing material to be retained. This is again that there may be a part of the wall which has the old plaster, and it will be easier if you remove that old plaster and plaster the whole wall, but it may be difficult, but still it is desirable that the old plaster be retained. We have seen some of the example in Pompeii and other, that whatever the old plaster is there, if they can be retained by consolidation and other process, retain that. It may not look beautiful, but that is not the objective of the conservation practice. Be harmonious in color, tone, texture, form and scale if additions are necessary, but should be less noticeable than the original material, while at the same time. You remember when we are talking about the Konark Sun Temple, that we saw that it was very noticeable that a new material has been added. There are very good example, Archaeological Survey of India very well preserves the things. So, here we take the example of the Mukteshwar temple in Bhubaneswar, Orissa, and where we can see that it is, there has been restoration, there has been some new elements, there has been some sort of measures have been taken, but the way it has been integrated with the site and the restoration process, it is a very good example of one of the best practice of this beautiful structure of Orissan style of architecture. We are again continuing. Any proposed intervention should not be undertaken by a conservator or restorator who are insufficiently trained or experienced unless they obtain competent advice. For example, I mean, when we go to a hospital, we always say that the doctor, who has the license and other, which has the experience, that should be treated, because one is dealing with a human life, or even or taking a journey by a flight, we need an experienced captain or a pilot. So, again when we are talking about the old structure and the conservation, one must understand that these are irreplaceable, and so the person who is doing the intervention should be an experienced one, and for that the training is important. Here we can see that in situ mosaic conservation, a technician training at the site of Tunisia, where they are talking about they are being trained. So, this is a very important part. We have to train the future generation in the proper techniques, and again the guided by the ethics, and which has to be discussed through the various repeated discussion with the proper documentation, authentic evidence and others. But all said and done, with all these standards or ethics or the technical skill, there will be cases, there are cases where they will be very unique, where we do not have a very sort of a set practice. So, each and every case is a learning experience. So, some problems are unique and have to be solved from the first principle on a trial and error basis, and one has to be more cautious during that. And this is an example of a beautiful structure in one of the Jamindar family in a very small village or small town in Khadar in West Midnapur. There are beautiful what we call the work, lime terrazzo work, and there are the stones which gives the date, which is an archival document, and these are very important part of the structures which are still there, which are retained there, whereas some part of the structure has sort of a decayed so much. So, this type of structure or whatever, one has to be very cautiously deal with that, and to be guided not only by the scientific techniques, documents and other, but by the ethics and the course of conservation. And each case is an unique experience and a learning experience. So, one has to work under a proper experienced conservator and with a proper guidance and proper discussion and proper documentation, one can intervene the building. And these are the generally what we can say the thumb rules or the some of the course for the ethics what guides the conservation practice. We had talked about how the conservation Venice Charter and other. So, in our next course we will talk about that how actually the conservation movement what we see today has actually took shape, the history of the conservation movement. Thank you.